Hello, my name is Eric Follick. I'm a Platonist, contemplative ascetic, and renunciant, and I'd like to read to you an essay that I wrote called Homer on the Three Platonic Hypostases, the Proteus episode of the Odyssey. The Odyssey of Homer is a most marvelous transhistorical, transmigratory, allegorical guidebook to contemplative ascetic renunciant spiritual practice, detailing the soul's journey in successive rebirths to return to its true home in the noetic realm and the absolute. All spiritual and religious systems and systems of practice take as their basis and presuppose a metaphysics or ontological and axiological understanding of the nature of reality, whether they explicitly recognize it or not. The metaphysics underlying the Odyssey is exactly the same as that presented by Plato and Plotinus, the system of the three Platonic hypostases. Plato and Plotinus both teach precisely the same metaphysical, spiritual, and soteriological system, even though many spiritually imperceptive modern scholars here in the Dark Ages are unable or unwilling to see this. In the much more illumined pre-modern world, this was more obvious to many. The three hypostases or levels of existence or reality are the one or the good, the absolute, the source and ground of everything, from which everything comes and to which everything returns, and which encompasses everything. Nous or the divine mind thought, the noetic realm of the ideas or forms, eternal and unchanging, and the level of soul, of space and time and individuation. Only the one or the good is wholly real and perfect and knowing. The other two hypostases or levels are descending levels of increased darkness and unreality and nescience within, so to speak, the one. The level of soul includes various aspects such as the nature and faculties and function of both our souls and the world soul, the production of space and time, the workings of dike or justice, or adastreia, a necessity, or karma or providence, the struggles of the soul on the path, and so forth. The Odyssey is particularly concerned by its nature with detailing the processes of this level, although the higher realities are always, of course, presumed in the background. It is not, therefore, especially concerned with giving systematic metaphysical expositions. The most explicit and systematic exposition of the three Platonic hypostases, combined, of course, with instructions for the path, occurs in the Proteus episode related by Menelaus to Telemachus in Book 4. In this essay, I will attempt to briefly explicate the undermeaning of this part of the text. Telemachus represents the conceptual or discriminating understanding and discernment of the practitioner's soul. This understanding is born of the combination of the true higher soul, Odysseus, and the lower embodied soul, Penelope. Penelope, the lower soul, dwells in Odysseus's house, the body, the embodied state of individuated sensate existence in space-time, harassed by and barely fending off the evil suitors, the passions and defilements and worldly emotions and desires, who unlawfully and against her will, and that of Telemachus, the understanding, occupy the domain or house of the lower soul. They unlawfully consume their livelihood, that is, they use up the lower soul's physical, emotional, and mental energies to feed themselves instead of conserving and allowing these energies to be used, having been turned by the higher soul, to proper divine and holy and ascetic purposes of contemplation and striving towards liberation from becoming, genesis. Throughout the Odyssey, the disturbing image of the sacrificing and eating of animals, the faculties and energies of the lower animal soul, and the libation and drinking of wine, the unavoidable pleasant or painful experiences of the senses, represent the maintenance and use of the physical and emotional and lower mental faculties of the soul and the senses that unfortunately have to be constantly attended to as long as we are still in becoming, in embodied sensate existence, but should be always only used as necessary for and totally dedicated to divine ascetic contemplative purposes, sacrificed to the gods before being consumed, and are by divine and holy higher souls committed to the path, but are misused by the defilements and worldly deluded souls only for worldly purposes and pleasures, sacrificed to the gods in name only, in the misguided attempt to obtain worldly advantages. The reason for the choice of the grotesque and horrific symbols and images of killing and eating of animals and consuming of alcohol, so revolting to the true contemplative ascetic and renunciant, is to serve as a continual reminder of how gross and painful and horrible and contemptible and miserable and burdensome and dark sensate existence and continued rebirth and physical and embodied life really is compared to the inconceivable bliss and brightness and knowing of the Absolute and reunion with and reabsorption therein, and to constantly inspire the renunciant with revulsion from this world and life and with desire for liberation and the good, and impel him to constantly strive for release and reunion, for the Absolute only. Penelope, the lower soul, and Telemachus, the conceptual understanding, long for the return of Odysseus, the true soul, the true higher divine soul, and the true contemplative ascetic practitioner, who, fully purified and developed and divinized by his long trials and adventures, will destroy the defilements, etc., the suitors, and be reunited with the lower embodied existence, and take proper care of it, and eventually get rid of it by drawing it up fully into the higher levels. Of course, they can never actually be separate during the course of the path, and Odysseus, the higher soul and contemplative ascetic, is always really present there. But for much of the path, the two seem to be separate, in that the constant need to maintain the psychophysical organism and deal with its attendant passions, etc., seem to be separate from and always cause problems for and drag one away from contemplation and holy practice. Note that in the Odyssey, the trials of Odysseus, Penelope, and Telemachus are actually all going on at the same time. At the beginning of the Odyssey, as the conditions are becoming ripe for Odysseus' return, Telemachus, the cognitive understanding, has now developed to the point that it understands more what is actually going on, and that the suitors, the defilements, have to be ejected and destroyed, the world needs to be renounced, the higher soul needs to return, and liberation only needs to be striven for. Athena, divine wisdom, in the guise of mentes and mentor, both meaning reminder, sends the understanding Telemachus on a journey of learning. First he learns piety and asceticism, but without philosophia, from Nestor. Then he travels to see Menelaus. Here he sees noetical beauty, Helen, and eventually, in response to his inquiring about Odysseus, Menelaus relates the Proteus episode that forms the main subject of this essay and provides a more structured exposition of the three hypostases. Even if I won't be able to explicate the undermeaning of every detail, the main features are clear. Menelaus represents a soul that has made quite significant progress on the path, but is still far from the end and will be detained for a while. He has firmly regained the vision of intelligible beauty, he has regained Helen, and has had a glimpse, however brief, of the one. He has had an encounter with Proteus, the first, and has learned a great deal from these and his practice so far. He has, however, not gone through all the necessary trials and practice for ultimately attaining the telos and destroying the defilements that Odysseus has. He still has many of his ships and his men, which unlike Odysseus he brought back with him, the various aspects and views and burdens of the lower self that need to be destroyed, however painfully, on the path. He has not learned all the things that Odysseus has learned in the various episodes that occur later in the Odyssey. He has, however, progressed and learned enough, and has a good enough lower self, also represented by Helen, that he was not destroyed by a bad lower self and the defilements and passions and wrong views upon prematurely returning like Agamemnon. He has avoided the, quote, fate of Agamemnon, unquote, referred to repeatedly in the text and related by Proteus as mentioned above. At the end of their discussion, Proteus assures him he knows from his vision of the Absolute that he won't fall totally back into Genesis, becoming, won't die and meet his fate in horse-grazing Argos, but will go to the Elysian plain of unchanging, pleasant, and easy life and weather, will remain in contact with the noetical realm, the second hypostasis, since he has the vision of noetical beauty, Helen, daughter of the divine order of things, Zeus. He is therefore still around in the sensate lower level of soul and individuated phenomena in space-time to be able to give instruction to the understanding, Telemachus, sort of like the writers of essays, maybe. Unlike the fully completed soul that has fully attained the telos and no longer perceives this world at all, but has become only the Absolute. Thus, in Menelaus and his situation, details, activities, etc., we have expounded, illustrated, and disclosed the third hypostasis, the level of soul, both ours and the world soul. Menelaus' relation of the Proteus episode begins with him and his ships and men stuck on a desert island, not too long after beginning his journey from the lower this world of Egypt to his return to Lacedaemon, stuck at a single and difficult and unpleasant place in his practice, because he did not offer sufficient complete hecatombs, sacrifices, to the gods before departing. He did not sufficiently practice asceticism, piety, holiness, and total devotion to the divine. He did not adequately dedicate all his physical, emotional, and mental existence, all the powers and faculties of the lower animal soul, to the divine and the attaining thereof. Thus his lower faculties are perishing and are hungry, having been deprived of their true use and good. At this point, though he is able to enter into contemplation of and contact with in contemplation of the divine mind thought, the noetic realm, the second hypostasis, which is expounded and represented here by the goddess Eidotea, contemplation of form, that's the meaning of her name, and the seals in their counting. So 2 of the 3 hypostases have been accounted for. He meets Eidotea significantly while wandering alone, in contemplation without the burden of his lower self, his men and ships, and enters into interaction with her, with the noetic realm, the divine mind thought. From this he learns that to find out what is going on, why he is stuck in his practice, he will have to at least briefly ascend to the one in contemplation, and that the divine mind thought itself will facilitate this. Proteus, the first, represents the one, the Absolute itself, the first Platonic hypostasis. So we now have all 3 hypostases revealed and presented in orderly fashion. Proteus, the one, is here presented in reverse fashion to emphasize his being the underlying source and ground of all phenomena, even the lowest. Thus he is described backwards as of and under Egypt, the sea, and Poseidon, all of which represent Hyla, the body, and bodily and sensate existence. Hyla is usually translated as matter, but that's not really, that can be a misleading translation. Maybe stuff might be better. Eidotea's instructions on how to catch her father Proteus, the approach to the good revealed through contact with the divine mind thought, and the events as they actually unfold largely coincide, and so will be explicated together without distinction here. Proteus emerges from the sea at high noon. The one is seen during and as and is the greatest illumination. Along with him emerge, and he is seen among, at the head of and beyond the ideas or forms, the seals. He counts the seals by fives, showing the rational order of the ideas and the beginning approach to the noetic through number and mathematics, shades of the politeia, that is, Plato's Republic. Menelaus and his few compatriots, this practicing soul is not yet to the point where he can enter this contemplation without any of the faculties of the lower soul remaining with him, are disguised by the divine mind thought as seals, as ideas. That is, it is through entrance into an identification with the noetic realm, nous, that the ascent can be made to seeing the good. For this soul as yet still burdened from behind, the entrance into and abiding in nous would be more than he could bear. The smell of the seals would be terrible, were it not for the pleasure of the noetic beauty, the ambrosia that Adotea places under their noses. Compare Phaedo 109e6, where the nature must be sufficient to bear the contemplating. When they grab Proteus, when they make the approach to the One, he turns into all manner of forms of animals and plants and physical elements. But they have to hang on and not let go until he returns to his actual form. The Absolute has to be discerned and kept in sight as beyond and throughout the experience of all the diversified phenomena. Compare Politeia 534b8 to d1, where the one who knows the idea of the good has to be able to abstract it from all things as in battle and know it truly in reality, not just in opinion. That's what's discussed in that Politeia passage. The first thing, and that for which this all has been undertaken, that Menelaus learns from Proteus, is that he is stuck on the island because he did not perform satisfactory sacrificial offerings to Zeus and the gods before leaving Egypt, and that he has to return to Egypt and do it before the gods will allow him to proceed safely and successfully on his way. This is highly significant. The first thing that the practitioner, that the soul learns in having a true vision or contemplation of the Absolute, however brief, is the absolute necessity of full-blown pure renunciation and asceticism and piety and holiness and total single-minded devotion to the divine in order to proceed truly and successfully on the path of contemplation and return home. Returning to the bodily sensate realm, he must uncompromisingly sacrifice and dedicate all the powers, maintenance, and faculties of the lower self, of the animal soul, of bodily life to the single divine and holy purpose of attaining reunion with the Absolute, of attaining liberation. The stream of all his energies must be wholly and holily directed to the divine without any diversion into the channels of worldly desires and the pursuit of sensual pleasures and the things of this world. His maintenance of the psychophysical organism, however greatly this occupies so much of our time and energy and attention in this world, must be solely for the purpose of be dedicated to the divine path and aspiration. This, as discussed above, is the understanding of the symbol of offering satisfactory hecatombs, of sacrifices or offerings. This is most important to understand, especially now in these dark times in the modern secular world, where there are many who claim to have known the Absolute, God, enlightenment, etc., and to teach others to attain this in, quote, meditation, unquote, what they refer to as meditation, but display understanding, teaching, and behavior that indicate that they couldn't possibly have true accomplishment. Anyone who has truly had even a little contact with the One in contemplation in reality knows the absolute necessity of renunciation, purity, holiness, and asceticism for and as the path. Contemplative asceticism is the very manifestation and reflection of the Absolute, of God, etc. in this world. Anyone who claims to have contemplative attainment, to have attained union realization, enlightenment, etc., and is not a pure contemplative ascetic, is not celibate, vegetarian, teetotaling, poor, abstaining from sensual and social pleasures, etc., and does not understand or teach this, or teaches people that they can attain this without being renunciants and without giving up this world, can, ipso facto, be dismissed as a fraud. Again, Homer, along with Plato and Plotinus, continually teaches true contemplative asceticism of the purest and most abstract and austere sort as the only possible path to liberation and realization of the absolute, as integral with and the flip side, as it were, in this world of the absolute divine reality itself. To become God, the soul must become godlike. This theme is further reinforced by the remaining subsidiary part of Proteus' revelation, in which he relates the fate or status of 3 of the chiefs of the Achaeans who made it out of Troy. Aias perished in the sea of Hyla, of bodily sensate existence, on the path home, because he departed from and closed himself to divine wisdom. He was hated by Athena, and because he fell from holiness and a proper supernatural understanding of the path, and into a naturalist humanist understanding of reality and the path, arrogating to himself the ability to accomplish a telos without the divine. He boasted in his blindness that he had been saved from the sea against the will of, rather than because of, the gods. Thus he was re-engulfed by Hyla and material bodily existence, believing this and purely human action to be real, and fell back into the ocean of birth and death, falling completely from the path, at least for the time being. Next he relates the fate of Agamemnon, the destruction or loss or falling from the path, for the time being again at least, of the soul that returns home, that attempts to ascend to the higher hypostases and thinks that it has, without at all adequate preparation, understanding, practice, or condition. He returns with all his ships and men, without at all having freed himself from the burden of the lower soul by going through the painful trials, purifications, and learnings of Odysseus, and with a bad lower self overcome by the passions and delusions and defilements, his wife overcome and surrendered to Aegisthus, not at all practicing holiness, morality, humility, asceticism, and renunciation that puts an end to the higher soul's attempts at liberation and plunges it back into the lower areas of rebirth. One need only look around, both in the past and especially in the present, to see examples of these 2 lamentable fates. Finally, he relates that Odysseus, the true ascetic practitioner and higher soul, is still alive, is still on the path, has lost all his ships and men, has been purified of the burden of the lower soul and the things of this world as is necessary, but is temporarily stuck on the island of and is detained by Calypso, the concealer, sensate life and sensory existence, but is longing and ready to return. The telos is getting nearer, though there's still a long way to go. The path, viewed from the temporal side of things, is a very long, difficult, and tricky journey. Very few are they who make it all the way through to the end and liberation. Thus it is clear that the Odyssey clearly and explicitly presents and presupposes the Platonic metaphysics of the 3 hypostases and their concomitant contemplative, ascetic, renunciant practice, the exposition being interleaved with instructions on the path. Homer, or rather the Muse, and Plato and Plotinus all teach the same Platonic idealist metaphysics or structure and understanding of the nature of reality, and teach it as inseparable from the contemplative, ascetic, renunciant spiritual path and soteriology of reunion with the one or the good, and liberation thereby from the cycle of repeated birth and death, or becoming of genesis. This is a most important lesson to learn. Idealist metaphysics and ontology of the absolute and the lower manifestations contained in it, and the contemplative, ascetic, and mystical spiritual practice and path intrinsically go together and are inseparable. They are two sides of the same coin, the reflections of each other in the non-temporal transcendent and temporal immanent spheres. We may be grateful for the manifestation of the Absolute in our present experiential fields as the Homeric muse for teaching us this. I hope you like that essay. Thank you very much.